They say Christmas Eve is for miracles, but at my husband's gold-plated table, the only miracle he wanted was my disappearance, while he gifted his mistress a luxury cruise. He tossed me a crumpled scratch-off like I was a beggar. The whole room laughed, unaware that $2 scrap of paper was actually a $100 million key to my freedom. This isn't a story about luck. It is a death sentence for traitors, executed in the middle of the ocean. My name is Dorothy Henshaw. I am 34 years old, and on the drive over to the Henshaw family estate in Greenwich, the heater in my 10-year-old sedan finally gave up the ghost. I shivered not just from the biting Connecticut winter air that seeped through the cracked windowsill, but from a deeper, more bone-chilling dread. The house loomed ahead, a sprawling Georgian monstrosity illuminated by thousands of tasteful white fairy lights. To the outside world, it looked like a Christmas card. To me, it looked like the mouth of a beast waiting to swallow me whole. I parked my rusting vehicle between a sleek black Porsche and a silver Bentley, the visual disparity so sharp it almost felt comical, in my hands. I clutched a gift I had spent the last 2 months making. It was a hand-knitted cashmere throw, crafted with an intricate cable pattern that had caused my fingers to cramp night after night. I had used the grocery money I saved by skipping lunches to buy the yarn. When the housekeeper opened the massive oak door, she didn't greet me. She simply held out a hand, took the package as if it were a bag of biohazardous waste, and dropped it carelessly behind a decorative potted fern in the foyer. It landed with a soft, pathetic thud. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive pine, roasted meats, and the heavy, cloying perfume of old money. The room was a sea of black Armani suits and designer silk dresses. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes sounded like tiny, brittle bells. I stood at the edge of the room, smoothing down the skirt of my dress, a modest piece I had bought on sale 3 years ago, and scanned the crowd for my husband. Richard was holding court near the fireplace, looking devastatingly handsome in a velvet tuxedo that probably cost more than my entire year's living allowance. He was laughing, his head thrown back, radiating the kind of charisma that used to make my knees weak. But he wasn't alone. Standing impossibly close to him was Elena Vance. Elena was 24, with hair the color of spun gold and ambition that radiated off her like heat. She was technically his executive assistant, but the way her hand lingered on his forearm suggested a job description that went far beyond managing spreadsheets. My mother-in-law, a woman whose face was pulled so tight by plastic surgery she looked permanently surprised, drifted past me. She paused just long enough to look me up and down with a sneer. "Beige again. Dorothy," she murmured, swirling her wine. "You always manage to blend into the wallpaper. Try not to embarrass Richard tonight. He has important investors here." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on Elena's neck. Resting against her throat was a diamond pendant, a solitaire teardrop stone suspended on a white gold chain. The room seemed to tilt. 2 weeks ago, I had found the receipt for that exact necklace in Richard's jacket pocket while doing laundry. When I asked him about it, he looked me in the eye and told me it was a retirement gift for the company's 60-year-old head of accounting. He had made me feel crazy for even asking. Now, seeing it glittering on Elena's skin, I realized the only crazy thing was my own willful blindness. Richard finally noticed me. Or rather, he noticed that I was blocking the path of a waiter. His eyes slid over me without a flicker of warmth, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved to the wrong spot. He didn't come over. He didn't introduce me to the men he was talking to. He simply turned his back and whispered something to Elena that made her giggle. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Richard tapped a spoon against his glass, bringing the roar of conversation to a halt. The room turned to him, faces expectant, eager for the performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice smooth and projecting perfectly to the back of the room. "Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Christmas Eve. It has been a record-breaking year for Sterling Horizon, and we could not have done it without the tireless dedication of our team." He turned to Elena, gesturing for her to step forward. She feigned shyness, placing a hand on her chest. "There is one person who has gone above and beyond," Richard continued, beaming at her, "for her sleepless nights and unwavering commitment to our vision. I have a special token of appreciation. Elena, darling." He produced a sleek gold envelope and handed it to her. She opened it with manicured fingers, gasping theatrically as she pulled out the boarding pass. "A full package on the Royal Serenity," Richard declared, and the room gasped in appreciation. "A week of luxury cruising, valued at $15,000. You earned it." "Oh, Richard, you shouldn't have," Elena squealed, throwing her arms around his neck. It was a hug that lasted 3 seconds too long to be professional. Over his shoulder. Her eyes found mine. She didn't look away. She smiled. A cold, predatory curving of lips that said, "I won." The guests applauded politely. I felt nausea rising in my throat, a physical rejection of the scene before me. Then, Richard cleared his throat again. "And of course," he said, his tone shifting. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a patronizing smirk. "My wife, Dorothy." The room went silent. Richard didn't reach for another gold envelope. He didn't signal for a large box. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his leather wallet. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed something onto the mahogany table in front of me. It was a scratch-off lottery ticket. It was crumpled at the corner. "I know you love dreaming, Dorothy," Richard said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe you will get lucky. Who knows, it might change your life." A ripple of laughter tore through the room. It wasn't warm laughter. It was sharp and cruel. I heard the whispers behind me. $2, is that a joke? Well, look at her. What would she even do with a real gift? She's just a leech anyway. Richard is a saint for putting up with her. The humiliation was a physical blow. It felt like he had slapped me across the face, but harder, because a slap would have acknowledged I was worth the energy of anger. This was just a dismissal. This was him telling me I was worth less than the lint in his pocket. My hand reached out. I saw my fingers trembling, shaking so violently I could barely grasp the piece of paper. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table over and shatter every piece of crystal in the room. I wanted to rip that necklace off Elena's throat, but I didn't. Decades of conditioning, of being told I wasn't good enough, of being beaten down by their passive-aggressive warfare, kept me frozen. I picked up the ticket. I forced the corners of my mouth up into a rigid line that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't a frown. I would not give them the satisfaction of tears. Not here, not now. "Thank you, Richard," I whispered, though nobody heard me over the resumed chatter. They had already lost interest, returning to their champagne and gossip. I was just the intermission entertainment, and the show was over. As I turned to retreat, desperate to find a corner where I could disappear, I felt a weight on me, a gaze, heavy and piercing. I looked toward the shadowed alcove near the library entrance. Arthur Henshaw was sitting there in his wheelchair. My father-in-law had once been the titan of industry who built Sterling Horizon from nothing. But a massive stroke 6 months ago had left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. Richard treated him like a potted plant, wheeling him out for appearances and ignoring him the rest of the time. But Arthur's mind was still there. I knew it. And tonight, as our eyes met across the room full of vultures picking at the carcass of my dignity, I saw something in his expression. It wasn't a pity. It was a sharp, blazing intensity. His good hand gripped the armrest of his wheelchair, his knuckles white. He was watching Richard. He was watching Elena. And then, he looked at the crumpled ticket in my hand, and his eyes narrowed with a look I couldn't decipher. It looked almost like anticipation. The heavy oak door of the guest powder room clicked shut, sealing me inside a sanctuary of marble and gold leaf. The silence here was thick, insulated from the cacophony of fake laughter and clinking crystal outside. But it did nothing to quiet the screaming in my head. I leaned against the cold vanity, staring at my reflection in the gilded mirror. The woman staring back looked fractured. My skin was pale, my eyes wide and watery, and the beige dress my mother-in-law had mocked seemed to hang off my frame like a shroud. I looked exactly like what they thought I was, a pathetic, discarded wife, tolerated only for the sake of appearances. In my hand, I still clutched the crumpled scratch-off ticket. It felt hot against my palm, a branding iron of my humiliation. Richard had thrown this at me like one might toss a bone to a stray dog. While he gave his mistress the world, a surge of hot, acidic bile rose in my throat. I raised my hands, ready to rip the colorful card into confetti. I wanted to flush it down the toilet and watch the last remnant of this miserable night swirl away. But then, my hands froze. The image of Arthur Henshaw's eyes flashed in my mind. The old man had been watching me with such fierce, desperate intensity. Why? Why would a man who could barely lift a spoon care about a $2 gag gift? There was something in his gaze that felt like a command, not pity. It was as if he was trying to push a thought into my head through sheer force of will. My fingers relaxed, smoothing the wrinkled edges of the card. Just to kill time. Just to wait until the redness in my eyes subsided, so I could leave without looking like I had been crying. That was what I told myself. I pulled my phone from my clutch. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the device once on the marble counter before I could unlock it. I opened the state lottery app, the screen glowing bright and harsh in the dim room. I found the scanner function and held the phone over the barcode at the bottom of the ticket. The camera struggled to focus in the low light, the little square dancing on the screen. Finally, it beeped. I expected a message saying sorry, not a winner, or perhaps a patronizing, "You won $2." Instead, the screen turned a bright, celebratory green. Confetti graphics rained down over a number that didn't make sense. I blinked, sure that the tears in my eyes were distorting my vision. I wiped my eyes and looked again. Jackpot winner. Prize amount $100 million. The air left the room. It didn't just leave. It felt as though the universe had vacuumed every molecule of oxygen out of the space, leaving me gasping in a vacuum. I didn't scream. I didn't cheer. I went completely, utterly still. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, a rhythm so violent I thought it might crack the bone. $100 million. Even after taxes. I did the mental math with a brain that felt like it was firing on alien synapses. That was roughly $60 million. $60 million. I was standing in a bathroom that cost more to renovate than I made in 5 years, holding a piece of paper that was worth more than this entire estate. It had to be a glitch, a cruel digital error. I refreshed the app. I scanned it again. $100 million. I opened a browser and went to the official state lottery website, typing in the serial number manually. Winner, claim at headquarters. I checked a third-party verification site. Jackpot confirmed. 3 times. It was real. I leaned back against the wall, sliding down until I hit the cold floor. The tiles bit into my legs, but I couldn't feel them. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. Richard had given me this. He had mocked me with it. He had thrown his fortune away to humiliate me. I sat there for 10 minutes, just breathing, in, out, with every breath. The trembling in my hands lessened, replaced by a cold, steely weight in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't joy. Joy is warm. This was ice. This was power. I stood up, fixed my hair, and unlocked the door. When I stepped back into the hallway, the party was still in full swing. I moved like a ghost, skirting the edges of the room. Through the French doors leading to the terrace, I saw them. Richard and Elena were standing in the shadows of the balcony. They thought they were hidden, but I could see them clearly. Richard's hand was resting low on her hip, his fingers splayed in a gesture of possessive ownership that made my stomach turn. He leaned in, whispering something into her ear, and she threw her head back, exposing her throat and the diamond necklace to the moonlight. They looked like royalty. They looked untouchable. Dorothy? The sound was a guttural rasp, barely human. I turned to see Arthur Henshaw in his wheelchair, tucked away in a dimly lit alcove near the library. His nurse was momentarily absent, likely fetching him a drink. He lifted his good hand. the movement jerky and spastic, beckoning me closer. I approached him slowly. "Arthur." He looked at me, his eyes clear and sharp amidst the ruin of his face. He tried to speak, his mouth working uselessly for a moment before he gave up. With a frustrated grunt, he reached into the pocket of his velvet smoking jacket. His hand shook violently as he grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, almost painful. He pressed something cold and hard into my palm. I looked down. It was a small, tarnished brass key. It looked old, the kind of key that belonged to furniture from a different century. Underneath the key was a scrap of paper, torn from a napkin. On it, written in shaky, jagged letters that must have taken him immense effort to form, were 3 words: "Basement, red safe." I looked up at him, shock warring with confusion. "Arthur, what is this?" He didn't answer. He just squeezed my hand again, his eyes locking onto mine with a desperate urgency. Then he shifted his gaze toward the balcony where his son was groping his mistress, and the look in the old man's eyes darkened into pure loathing. He wasn't senile. Richard told everyone his father had lost his mind, that the stroke had turned him into a vegetable. But Richard lied about everything else. Why had I ever believed him about this? Arthur knew. He knew about Elena. He knew about the humiliation. And he was giving me something else. Something that, judging by the weight of the key in my hand, was just as dangerous as the lottery ticket. I nodded once, closing my fingers tightly around the key and the note. "I understand," I whispered, though I didn't, not fully, but I trusted him. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't seek out Richard to tell him I was leaving. I simply walked out the front door, past the silver Bentley and the black Porsche, and got into my freezing, rattling car. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. Richard had insisted I live in a separate apartment in a rundown part of town 3 months ago. He claimed it was to help me find myself and build character before we started a family. But I knew now it was just to get me out of the way so he could bring Elena to the marital bed without looking over his shoulder. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my unit, the smell of stale cigarettes and boiled cabbage permeating the hallway. Inside, the apartment was cold. The radiator hissed but produced no heat. I sat on the edge of my sagging mattress, the streetlights outside casting long, prison-bar shadows across the floor. I took the ticket out of my purse. I slipped it inside the pillowcase of my only pillow. Then I took the brass key and hid it inside the toe of my winter boot in the closet. I lay down, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of a drowning continent. I didn't sleep. I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I blinked, I saw the number, $100 million. And then I saw Richard's hand on Elena's hip. I wasn't the sad, beige Dorothy anymore, lying there in the dark. I felt something inside me harden, calcifying into something unbreakable. I wasn't just a wife. I was a hunter who had just been handed a loaded rifle, and morning could not come fast enough. I waited until 9 in the morning. From my parked car down the block, I watched Richard's silver Bentley slide out of the driveway, heading toward the glass towers of Sterling Horizon. He was off to play the role of the titan of industry, leaving his castle unguarded. I gave him 20 minutes to clear the city limits before I started the engine of my battered sedan and drove up to the gates. My heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands on the steering wheel were steady. I wasn't the trembling woman from last night anymore. I was a woman on a mission. When I rang the doorbell, Maria, the head housekeeper, answered. She didn't open the door fully, blocking the entrance with her sturdy frame. Her eyes flicked over my worn coat with familiar disdain. "Mr. Henshaw is not home. Mrs. Henshaw," she said, the title dripping with irony coming from her lips. She knew exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of this house, which was somewhere below the purebred corgis. "I know. Maria," I said, forcing a vapid, flustered smile. "I left my scarf here last night, the red cashmere one. It was a gift from my grandmother. Richard will be furious if I lose it." She hesitated, weighing the inconvenience of letting me in against the potential drama of a lost heirloom. Finally, she stepped back with a heavy sigh. "5 minutes. I have floors to polish." "I will be quick," I promised. As soon as she disappeared into the kitchen, the smile vanished from my face. I didn't go to the living room. I moved silently across the foyer, my cheap sneakers making no sound on the marble, and slipped through the door under the main staircase. The basement air hit me like a physical wall cold, damp, and smelling of mildew and decay. This was Arthur's domain, a place where the family stored the things they didn't want to see but couldn't bear to throw away. It was a graveyard of memories. I pulled the string for the single bulb overhead, and the room was bathed in a sickly yellow light. It was a labyrinth of stacked furniture, boxes of tax records from the 90s, and draped statues that looked like ghosts. I moved deeper into the shadows, following the mental map Arthur must have had when he gave me the key. Red safe. I found it in the furthest corner, hidden behind a stack of moth-eaten Persian rugs and a dusty tarp. It was an old, heavy iron box, painted a chipping crimson. It looked like something from a different era, sturdy and unyielding. I knelt on the cold concrete. My fingers fumbled as I pulled the brass key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a satisfyingly heavy click. I turned it, and the heavy door groaned open. I expected stacks of cash, maybe jewelry, but the safe was filled with paper. I pulled out the first stack of file folders. They were financial records, but not the official ones Richard showed the shareholders. These were the shadow books. As a graphic designer, I had a keen eye for detail, but you didn't need an accounting degree to understand what I was looking at. Richard was bleeding Sterling Horizon dry. There were transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. There were withdrawals labeled consulting fees that went directly into accounts linked to high-stakes online gambling sites. And then there were the expenses for Elena, the apartment rental in Manhattan, the lease on a Porsche, the jewelry. It totaled over $2 million in the last 18 months alone. He wasn't just rich and mean, he was a thief. He was stealing from the company his father built to fund the lifestyle of the woman he was cheating on me with. But the next document made the air freeze in my lungs. It was a loan agreement, a high-interest, short-term loan from a private lending firm that sounded more like a front for organized crime. The collateral listed wasn't the Henshaw estate. It was a property in Vermont. My property, the small, lakeside cottage my grandmother had left me. It was the only thing I owned in this world, the only place I had ever felt safe. I flipped to the signature page. There, at the bottom, was my name, Dorothy Henshaw. But I had never signed this. The loops were too wide, the slant too aggressive. It was a forgery, a clumsy one, but legally binding enough to lose me my home if he defaulted. And looking at his gambling losses, he was definitely going to default. Rage, hot and blinding, flared behind my eyes. He had stolen my dignity, and now he was stealing my past. I shoved the papers aside and picked up the next item. It was a black leather-bound notebook. I recognized the handwriting immediately, though it was jagged and erratic, written by a hand fighting against tremors. It was Arthur's diary. I opened it to a page dated 3 weeks ago. Richard came today. He thinks I am asleep. He was on the phone with his lawyer. They are planning the divorce for January. He wants to frame Dorothy. He hired a man to plant evidence of an affair on her computer. He says he will leave her with nothing, not a penny. He laughed about it. My hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. I turned the page. I am a prisoner in my own house. My mind is clear, but my body betrays me, and he is making it worse. I frowned, reaching for the last item in the safe. It was a manila envelope labeled medical. Inside were printouts of Arthur's medication schedule and a toxicology report from a private lab. Richard wasn't just neglecting his father, he was poisoning him. The logs showed that Richard had instructed the private nurse likely paid off to administer 3 times the recommended dose of sedatives and antipsychotics. The drugs were designed to induce confusion, memory loss, and motor control failure. They were making Arthur look like he had advanced dementia so that Richard could invoke power of attorney and take full control of the family trust. Arthur wasn't losing his mind. He was being chemically lobotomized by his own son. I sat back on my heels, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's monstrosity. A week ago, this would have broken me. I would have curled up on this cold floor and wept for the cruelty of the world. But the woman who walked into this basement was gone. The woman sitting here now had $100 million waiting for her, and she had the ammunition to destroy a dynasty. I took out my phone. I didn't rush. I moved with the cold. Mechanical precision of a crime scene photographer, I photographed every page of the ledger. I took close-ups of the forged signature on the mortgage deed. I captured every heartbreaking, shaky entry in Arthur's diary and every line of the damning medical logs. I uploaded them immediately to a secure cloud server, then sent a backup to a brand-new, encrypted email address I had created that morning. I put everything back exactly as I found it: the files, the diary, the poison logs. I locked the safe and covered it with the dusty tarp. When I climbed the stairs and emerged back into the hallway, the house felt different. It didn't feel like a monster's mouth anymore. It felt like a crime scene waiting for the yellow tape. I walked toward the front door. As I passed the grand foyer, I stopped in front of the massive oil painting hanging above the fireplace. It was a portrait of the Henshaw family commissioned 5 years ago. Richard stood in the center, looking noble and benevolent, his hand resting on Arthur's shoulder. I stared at Richard's painted face. I saw the arrogance in his eyes that the artist had captured perhaps too well. He thought he was a god in this house. He thought I was an insect he could crush under his designer shoe. "You have no idea what is coming for you," I whispered to the canvas. I walked out the front door, past Maria, who was scrubbing the porch. She didn't look up. "Did you find your scarf?" she muttered. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and cold as the winter wind. "I found exactly what I was looking for." I got into my car and drove away. I didn't look back. There was no need. I knew I would be back, and when I returned, I wouldn't be knocking on the door. I would be burning it down. I did not drive to the state lottery headquarters. That is what a lucky person does. They run to claim their prize, flashing their winning smile for the cameras, painting a target on their back for every grifter and long-lost cousin in the tri-state area. I was not a lucky person. I was a woman preparing for a siege. Instead of the lottery office, I drove straight to Manhattan. I spent the ride searching for a specific kind of predator. I didn't want a family law attorney who specialized in mediation and amicable splits. I needed a shark. I searched for the one name that made my husband's face turn a fascinating shade of purple whenever it was mentioned in the business section of the newspaper Silas Thorne. He was a corporate litigator known for two things: his exorbitant fees and his absolute refusal to settle when he smelled blood. He had sued Sterling Horizon 5 years ago on behalf of a minor shareholder and won. Richard hated him. That made him perfect. Silas Thorne's office was on the 45th floor of a Glass Needle in Midtown. It smelled of espresso and intimidation. When I walked in, wearing my beige coat and sensible shoes, the receptionist looked ready to call security. I didn't give her the chance. I told her I had a sensitive financial matter involving Sterling Horizon and that I could pay the retainer in cash. Immediately, that got me 5 minutes. Silas was younger than I expected, perhaps in his late 40s, with eyes that looked like they had seen every sin humanity was capable of committing. He sat behind a desk that looked like a slab of obsidian, checking his watch as I sat down. "Mrs. Henshaw," he said, his voice dry, "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Unless you are here to tell me your husband is finally confessing to that tax evasion scheme I suspected in 2020. Make it quick." "I am not here to talk about my husband's taxes yet," I said, placing my purse on my lap. "I am here to hire you, and I have 2 conditions. First, nobody knows I am your client. Second, you are going to help me destroy him." Silas raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Divorce cases are messy. Mrs. Henshaw, I don't do domestic squabbles." "This isn't a squabble," I said, "and I can pay your rate." "My rate is $1,200 an hour." I reached into my bag and pulled out the lottery ticket. I slid it across the obsidian desk until it rested under his hand. "Will $100 million cover it?" Silas looked at the ticket. He looked at me. Then he picked up his desk phone and pressed a button. Cancel the lunch meeting and bring me the blind trust paperwork. For the next 2 hours, we built the fortress. I instructed Silas to set up a blind trust to claim the winnings. My name would appear nowhere on the public record. As far as the world was concerned, an anonymous LLC was the winner. The money would be wire transferred into a secure account within 48 hours. Once the financial architecture was in place, I took out my phone. Now, I said. About the destruction part. I showed him the photos from Arthur's safe. I watched Silas's face transform. The bored arrogance vanished, replaced by the sharp, hungry focus of a predator catching a scent. He swiped through the images of the forged mortgage documents, the offshore accounts, and finally, the toxicology reports and medication logs. He leaned back, tenting his fingers. This isn't just leverage for a divorce settlement. Dorothy, this is a nuclear weapon. We are looking at fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and attempted manslaughter. If we play this right, Richard doesn't just lose his company, he goes to prison for 20 years. I don't want a settlement, I told him, my voice steady. I want him to have nothing. I want his reputation incinerated. I want him to feel exactly as helpless as he has made me feel for the last 10 years. Then we need to be surgical, Silas said, pulling a legal pad toward him. We haven't filed yet. We let him think he is safe. We let him get on that boat. We hire private investigators to document his movements with the Mistress. We build a case so watertight that when we drop the hammer, he won't even be able to breathe. I left his office with a contract signed and a team of 3 private investigators already being dispatched to tail Richard and Elena. But there was one loose end I had to tie up myself. One that required dirty hands. I drove back to Greenwich, stopping at a pharmacy to buy a bottle of high-grade multivitamins. I emptied the bottle into a Ziploc bag. Then I drove to the service entrance of the Henshaw estate. I knew the schedule. At 3 p.m, the senior staff took their break, leaving the junior maid, a young girl named Clara, to prepare the evening medications. Clara was 19, underpaid, and terrified of Richard, but she had always been kind to me. I caught her by the trash cans. She jumped when she saw me. Mrs. Henshaw, you shouldn't be here, she whispered, looking around fearfully. I need a favor. Clara, I said, pressing an envelope into her hand. Inside was $2,000, every cent I had left in my personal checking account. It was more than she made in a month. Her eyes widened. What is this? This is for your tuition, I lied smoothly. I need you to do one thing. The pills in Mr. Arthur's evening tray. The blue ones. Swap them with these. I handed her the bag of vitamins. Do it every day until the family leaves for the cruise. If anyone asks, you never saw me. She looked at the money, then at the vitamins. She knew something was wrong in that house. The staff always knew. She nodded quickly, shoved the envelope into her apron, and darted back inside. Arthur would be safe. He would start clearing the fog from his mind just in time for the finale. By the next evening, the first report from the private investigator arrived in my secure email. It was brutal in its efficiency. There were high-resolution telephoto images of Richard and Elena in his office at Sterling Horizon. They were not working. The photos were explicit enough to make a judge blush, but it was the audio file attached that made my blood run cold. I put on my headphones and clicked play. The sound of clinking glass filled my ears, followed by Richard's laughing voice. Don't worry, babe. The idiot is going to sign the house over tomorrow. She thinks it is for insurance paperwork. Once I have the deed, I am selling it to cover the Vegas debt. When we get back from the cruise, I will kick her to the street. She can go live in her car for all I care. I took off my headphones. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt a strange, cold sense of validation. He had just confirmed everything. He wasn't just a bad husband. He was an enemy combatant. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Silas. The trust is active. The funds have been verified. $100 million will be in your control in 48 hours. The gun is loaded. Dorothy. I looked at the text, then at the picture of Richard laughing on my screen. I wasn't just holding a gun. I was holding the trigger to a bomb, and I was going to enjoy watching the countdown. Richard arrived at my apartment at 7:30 in the evening, the night before the cruise. The air in the room instantly felt heavier, as if his very presence consumed the available oxygen. He was wearing his casual travel clothes, a cashmere sweater and designer jeans that cost more than the furniture in my living room, trying to create the image of a relaxed, loving husband stopping by to check on his wife. It was a performance, and a sloppy one at that. He placed a bottle of wine on the counter, a vintage red, though he knew I preferred white. He didn't pour it. Instead, he pulled a thick manila envelope from his leather satchel and slid it across the chipped laminate of the kitchen table. "Just some housekeeping before I go. Dottie," he said, using the nickname I hated. He flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Since I will be out of reach on the ocean, legal wants us to update our insurance policies, just standard liability stuff for the company. I need your signature on the highlighted lines." I looked at the stack of papers. My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It wasn't insurance. These were the transfer deeds for the Vermont cottage, the documents I had seen the forged versions of in the red safe. He was trying to get me to sign them legitimately, so he could sell my grandmother's legacy to cover his gambling debts before he even returned from his vacation. The audacity was breathtaking. I picked up the pen he offered, his eyes locked onto my hand, hungry and impatient. I brought the pen tip to the paper, watching his shoulders tense in anticipation. Then I stopped. I squinted, pulling the paper closer, then pushing it away. "Oh, damn it," I muttered, dropping the pen. "I left my reading glasses at the office today. The print is blurring together." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't need to read it, Dottie. It is just a standard boilerplate. Just sign it so I can get it to the lawyers in the morning." "I can't sign what I can't read. Richard, you know how my father was about contracts," I said, infusing my voice with a ditzy, apologetic tone that I knew annoyed him. "I will swing by the office early tomorrow, grab my glasses, and sign them. I can drop them off at your lawyer's office before noon. Promise." "I need them tonight," he snapped, his mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Why?" I widened my eyes, feigning innocence. "Is the insurance company open at 8 at night? Don't worry. Honey, I will handle it first." He stared at me, searching for any sign of deception. I held his gaze, blinking blandly, projecting nothing but helpful stupidity. Finally, he let out a sharp exhale through his nose. He couldn't push harder without raising suspicion. He snatched the papers back and shoved them into his bag. "Fine. Drop them at the firm by 10 in the morning. Do not forget, Dorothy, it is important for my protection." "Of course, Richard. I would never let anything happen to you," I said. The double meaning tasted sweet on my tongue. He stood up to leave, looking around my cramped apartment with a sneer he didn't bother to hide. He walked over to me and placed a kiss on my forehead. His lips were cold and dry. It felt like being kissed by a lizard. I had to physically restrain myself from wiping the spot the moment he pulled away. "Be good," he said, patronizingly. "Don't wait up." 5 minutes after he left, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from Elena. "Hi, Dorothy. I just wanted to say bye before the business trip. I'm going to look for a cute souvenir for you at the ports. Take care of yourself, XOXO." I stared at the screen. The sheer cruelty of it was almost impressive. She was going on a romantic getaway with my husband, funded by money stolen from my family. And she was texting me like we were sorority sisters. She wanted to feel benevolent. She wanted to convince herself she wasn't the villain. I typed back a single smiling emoji. It was the digital equivalent of a blank stare. Inside, I was laughing. "Buy me a souvenir." I thought, "I have already bought you a prison cell." The next morning, the day of departure, was gray and overcast. I drove to the private airfield where the company jet was waiting to take the executive team to Miami. Where the cruise ship was docked, I played the part of the dutiful wife perfectly. I wore a modest blue dress and stood by the hangar, waving to the staff. Elena was there, wearing a sundress and a floppy hat, looking ready for a photo shoot. She gave me a little wave, her eyes dancing with triumph. Richard was busy shouting at a luggage handler about his golf clubs. I walked up to him one last time. He looked impatient, checking his watch, eager to be in the air and away from the burden of his marriage. "Here," I said softly, reaching out to adjust his silk tie. I tightened the knot just a fraction, enough for him to feel the pressure against his throat. He looked down at me, startled. I leaned in close, standing on my tiptoes so my lips brushed his ear. "You make sure to enjoy yourself. Richard, I really enjoyed it, because when you come back, everything is going to be very different." He pulled back, frowning. He searched my face, but I was already smiling my practiced, harmless smile. He decided it was just a generic well-wish from a clingy wife. "Yeah, sure, bye, Dorothy," he muttered, turning his back on me to jog up the stairs to the jet. I stood on the tarmac and watched. I watched the door seal shut. I watched the engines roar to life, kicking up dust and debris. I watched the sleek metal bird taxi down the runway and lift off into the gray sky, carrying the two people who had tried to destroy me. As soon as the plane disappeared into the clouds, the smile dropped from my face like a stone. My posture straightened. The submissive wife died on that tarmac. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had memorized. "It is wheels up," I said into the receiver. "Start it." "Understood." Silas Thorne's voice came back, sharp and precise. "The filings are being submitted to the court as we speak. The accounts are frozen. The trap is sprung." I hung up and walked back to my car. I did not go home. I drove straight to the private care facility where Arthur was being held. I had already arranged everything. The advanced payment, a staggering sum borrowed against the verified lottery claim, had cleared that morning. When I arrived, 2 large orderlies from the new, high-security nursing home were already waiting. We bypassed the front desk. I marched straight to Arthur's room. He was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, looking frail and small. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and fear. "We are leaving, Arthur," I told him, crouching down beside him. "Richard is gone. His mother can't stop us. I am taking you somewhere safe, somewhere they don't use poison for medicine." He gripped my hand, his knuckles white. A single tear tracked through the deep lines of his face. I wheeled him out past the confused nurses. When the facility director tried to block my path, claiming I didn't have authorization, I handed him a court order Silas had obtained an hour ago, granting me temporary emergency guardianship based on evidence of medical abuse. The director paled and stepped aside. We loaded Arthur into the waiting luxury ambulance. As the doors closed, sealing us in safety, I looked at my father-in-law. "Rest now," I said, smoothing the blanket over his legs. "You need your strength. The show is about to begin, and you are going to want a front-row seat." The ambulance pulled away, heading toward a sanctuary where no Henshaw could hurt him. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and Richard was 30,000 feet in the air, flying toward a hurricane he didn't even know existed. 2 days after the Royal Serenity left the port of Miami, cutting a path through the turquoise waters toward the Caribbean, I made my first public move. It was not a scream. It was a whisper, designed to travel fast. I stood on the limestone terrace of a sprawling estate in the Hamptons. It was not the Henshaw house. It was a property I had purchased that morning through a shell corporation. Paying cash $15 million wired instantly from the trust. It was a fortress of glass and steel, overlooking the ocean, far colder and more magnificent than the dusty colonial pile Richard was so proud of. I took a photo of myself, in the frame. I wore a white silk suit, my hair cut into a sharp bob that framed my face. Behind me, the massive house and the gray Atlantic Ocean stretched out. I posted it to my social media accounts, which I knew Richard checked obsessively despite his disdain for me. The caption was simple: "New beginnings, goodbye past." Within an hour, the notifications blew up. Friends, fake ones, asking what it meant. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years commenting with heart emojis. And in the background of the local news cycle, the headlines were already buzzing. "Mystery winner claims $100 million Powerball jackpot in Connecticut." They didn't have a name yet, Just a location and the confirmation that the ticket was real. The speculation was feverish. Everyone was looking for the winner. But nobody looked at the abandoned wife of Richard Henshaw. While the internet gossiped, I sat in the library of my new home with Silas Thorne. We had work to do. "The debt purchase is complete," Silas said, sliding a thick document across the table. My contacts reached out to the private lenders Richard used. They were more than happy to offload a high-risk loan for a lump sum payment. I looked at the papers. Richard had borrowed $2 million from a shadow lending group called Onyx Capital Loan Sharks in expensive suits. The interest rates were predatory, and the terms were violent. Richard had used the money to cover his gambling losses and fund Elena's lifestyle. Assuming he could pay it back after he sold my grandmother's house and liquidated some company assets. "So, I own him?" I asked, tracing the line where the creditor's rights were transferred to my anonymous LLC, Nemesis Holdings. "You own him," Silas confirmed with a shark-like grin. "You are now his primary creditor, and since he has missed 2 payments while scrambling for the mortgage fraud, you have the right to call in the entire loan immediately." "Do it," I said, "and Silas freeze everything else." Silas nodded and typed a command on his laptop. It was anticlimactic in execution, but devastating in effect. With a few keystrokes, injunctions were sent to every major bank where Richard or Sterling Horizon held accounts, citing pending litigation for massive financial fraud. I closed my eyes and pictured where Richard was right at that moment. I knew the itinerary. It was 7 in the evening on the ship. The captain's gala. Richard would be wearing his white dinner jacket, guiding Elena into the crystal room for a champagne toast. He would be eager to show off, to buy a round of vintage Dom Perignon for the table of potential investors he had undoubtedly cornered. I wasn't there, but thanks to the reports from the private investigator Silas had placed on board, I knew exactly how it played out. Richard snapped his fingers for the sommelier. He ordered 3 bottles of the 1998 vintage, costing $4,000. He laughed loud, booming laughter, his hand resting on Elena's bare shoulder. When the bill came, he tossed his Platinum American Express card onto the tray with the casual arrogance of a man who believes the world owes him everything. The waiter took the card. He walked away. He came back 2 minutes later, leaning down to whisper, "I am sorry, sir. The card was declined." Richard would have frowned, annoyed but not panicked. "Try it again. The chip is probably dirty." The waiter tried again, declined. Richard laughed nervously, apologizing to the table. "Bank security," he would say. "They see a foreign charge and panic. Hold on." He pulled out his corporate Visa, declined. He pulled out his personal debit card, declined. The silence at the table would have been deafening. Elena's smile would have faltered, her eyes darting around to see if anyone was watching. The waiter, losing patience, would have asked loudly, "Do you have another form of payment, sir?" Richard, red-faced and sweating, would have had to excuse himself, leaving Elena sitting alone with the unpaid bill and the judging stares of the other guests. Back in my library, my phone rang. It was the landline I had forwarded to my cell. "Mrs. Henshaw." The voice was frantic. It was Richard's vice president, a man named Miller. "Yes, Mr. Miller," I answered, my voice calm. "Is Richard with you? I can't reach him." "It is a disaster here. Dorothy, the IRS is here. The SEC is here. They are raiding the office." "Slow down," I said, feigning shock. "What do you mean?" "Agents. Federal agents." Miller was screaming now. "They have a warrant. They say they received a tip about massive embezzlement and tax fraud. They are seizing the servers. They are boxing up Richard's office. They are asking for the general ledger." "Oh my God," I gasped. "That sounds terrible. I don't know where Richard is. I think he is traveling." Traveling. He needs to be here. They are freezing the payroll accounts." I hung up on him. 10 minutes later, my cell phone buzzed. It was Richard. He was calling from the ship's satellite phone, costing $10 a minute. I let it ring. I watched the screen light up with his name husband. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. He called again immediately. I picked up the phone but didn't say anything. I just breathed into the receiver. "Dorothy, pick up the damn phone." Richard's voice was high-pitched, laced with a panic I had never heard before. "Why are my cards not working? I'm trying to buy dinner and I look like an idiot. Did you do something with the joint account?" I remained silent. "Dorothy, are you there? Listen to me. Transfer $50,000 from the savings account to my wire routing number right now. It is an emergency. The bank made a mistake." "I can't do that, Richard," I said softly. "What do you mean, you can't just go to the bank?" "There is no money in the savings account. Richard, I closed it." "You what?" He sounded like he was choking. "And I can't help you with your cards," I continued, my voice hardening, "because I am busy reading the news. It seems Sterling Horizon is having a bit of a problem. Something about a raid." "How do you know that—" He stopped. The background noise of the ship, the wind, the music filtered through. "Dorothy, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Richard, but Karma. She is a real worker." I hung up. I blocked the number. On the deck of the Royal Serenity, Richard must have stared at the phone in disbelief. Elena would have walked up to him then, asking why the waiter was threatening to call security. She would have seen the sweat dripping down his face, the way his hands shook. She was a survivor, a parasite who needed a healthy host. Seeing Richard crumble, seeing the fear in his eyes, she would have felt the first cold prickle of realization that she had bet on a dying horse. But I wasn't done. I turned back to my laptop. I had one more message to send before I went to bed in my new master suite with Egyptian cotton sheets. I opened a drafted email. The recipients included every member of the Sterling Horizon Board of Directors, the major shareholders, and the company's external legal counsel. I also CC'd Richard's work email and his personal email. The subject line was urgent evidence of CEO embezzlement and fraud. Attached were 20 PDF files, the photos of the red safe documents, the ledger entries showing the payments to the shell companies. The receipts for Elena's jewelry were paid for with company funds, the forged mortgage documents, and the pièce de résistance, the audio file of him admitting to the fraud and his plan to leave me homeless. I hovered my mouse over the send button. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I thought of the $2 lottery ticket. I thought of the way he looked at me when he threw it on the table. I clicked send. The message whooshed away. Within seconds, it would be landing in inboxes all over Wall Street. By morning, Richard wouldn't just be broke, he would be the most toxic man in American business. I closed the laptop. "Checkmate," I whispered to the empty room. I stood up and poured myself a glass of wine. It was a very expensive vintage, and it tasted like victory. 3,000 miles away, in the middle of the turquoise Caribbean Sea, my husband was discovering that hell is not a place of fire and brimstone, but a luxury suite with spotty satellite internet. According to the logs from the private investigator who was shadowing them, Richard received the notification of my mass email at 2 p.m. He was lounging on a deck chair, sipping a mojito that cost $30. When his phone buzzed, I can picture the scene with crystal clarity. The ocean breeze was ruffling his hair. The sun was beating down on his tanned skin, and he was feeling like the king of the world. Then, he tapped the screen. The ship's Wi-Fi was notoriously temperamental, a detail I had counted on to increase his suffering. The email header would have loaded first urgent evidence of CEO embezzlement and fraud. He must have stared at those words while the little loading circle spun and spun, mocking him. For 5 agonizing minutes, he sat there, sweat beading on his forehead, tapping the screen furiously as the connection dropped and reconnected. When the file finally opened, his world ended. He didn't just see the documents, he saw his own execution warrant. His first instinct, typical of a coward, was to find a shield. He scrambled to dial the landline at the Greenwich estate. He needed Arthur. If he could get his father on the phone, if he could bully the confused old man into signing a statement saying he had authorized the transfers, Richard might have a chance to spin this. But the phone rang and rang. Finally, Maria answered, her voice trembling. "Where is my father?" Richard screamed into the receiver, ignoring the startled looks of the sunbathers nearby. "Put him on the line." "He is gone, Mr. Richard," Maria stammered. "Mrs. Henshaw? Dorothy?" "She came with an ambulance, and men in suits. They took him away yesterday. They had a court order." "What do you mean, she took him where?" "I don't know. They wouldn't tell me." Richard threw his phone onto the deck chair. It bounced and slid across the teak wood. He was hyperventilating, his leverage, his scapegoat. His silent victim, Arthur, was gone. And if Arthur was with me, that meant Arthur was talking. Richard tried to regain his composure. He smoothed his hair and walked toward the ship's bar, desperate for a drink to steady his nerves. But the news traveled faster than the ship. The email I sent had gone to the board members, many of whom were connected to the very people vacationing on this exclusive cruise. Rumors of the FBI raid on Sterling Horizon had leaped from Wall Street to the satellite phones of the wealthy passengers in record time. As Richard approached the bar, a man he had been laughing with at dinner the night before, a venture capitalist from Boston, saw him coming. The man didn't wave. He didn't smile. He deliberately turned his back and picked up his towel, signaling his wife to leave. Richard froze. He looked around. Eyes that had been admiring yesterday were now cold, suspicious, and distant. He was a leper. The smell of financial ruin was on him, and in their world, that was contagious. He retreated to his cabin, where Elena was trying on a pair of diamond earrings he had bought her with stolen money. She looked up, smiling, until she saw his face. "What is wrong?" she asked, putting the earring down. "Did the card get fixed?" Richard didn't answer. He paced the small room, muttering to himself. She knows. She knows everything. She has the ledger." "Who the old hag?" Elena laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "So what? It is your word against hers. She is just a housewife." "She sent the documents to the board. You idiot," Richard roared, turning on her. "And she didn't just send my records. She sent yours." Elena froze. "Mine." Richard grabbed his tablet and shoved it at her. "Read it." Elena scrolled through the PDF I had attached. Her eyes widened as she reached page 10. There, in black and white, were the incorporation papers for the shell companies used to launder the embezzled funds. Vance Consulting, LLC, Elena V. Holdings. "My name," she whispered, the blood draining from her face. "Why is my name on these accounts?" "I needed a signatory," Richard shouted, throwing his hands up. "I couldn't use mine." "You used me to launder money," Elena screamed, her voice cracking. "You told me those papers were for a tax shelter for my bonus. You told me it was legal." "It doesn't matter what I told you. You signed them." Elena lunged at him. It wasn't a graceful movement. It was feral. She slapped him across the face, the sound sharp and violent in the confined space. "You bastard. I am going to jail because of you." Richard caught her wrist before she could strike again. He twisted it hard, shoving her back onto the bed. His face was twisted into a snarl that shed the last remnants of his charming executive mask. "You listen to me," he hissed, pointing a finger in her face. "We are in this together. If I go down, you go down twice as hard. You are the one on the paperwork, so you better shut your mouth and do exactly what I say." Elena huddled on the bed, sobbing, clutching her wrist. The romance was dead. The luxury was gone. There was only fear now, trapped in a gold-plated cage floating in the middle of the ocean. That was when I dropped the anchor. I picked up my phone and opened the family group chat. It included Richard, his mother Beatrice, his 2 sisters, and several cousins. It was a group I had been muted in for years, a place where they shared photos of vacations I wasn't invited to. I typed a single message. "Emergency family meeting. 8 in the evening tonight. Video call. Attendance is mandatory. If you are absent, the police will receive the second batch of evidence, which includes the family trust's tax evasion history." I hit send. The reaction was instantaneous. My phone lit up. Beatrice was calling. I declined it. His sister called, declined. Beatrice called again, declined. They were panicking. They knew that Richard was reckless, but they had always assumed the family money was insulated. My threat to expose the trust a bluff. Mostly, but they didn't know that struck at the only thing they cared about, their inheritance. On the ship, Richard looked at the message. He was cornered. He was cut off from his father, cut off from his funds, and now he was being summoned like a naughty schoolboy. But Richard was a narcissist. Even in the face of total destruction, his brain rewired the narrative to protect his ego. He convinced himself that I was bluffing. He told himself that I was just a hurt, jealous woman acting out. He thought he could talk his way out of it. He thought he could charm or bully me one last time. "Get up," he barked at Elena. "Fix your face. Put on the dress I bought you." "I am not doing anything for you," she spat. "You are going to sit next to me on that call," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. "And you are going to tell them that Dorothy is lying, that she is crazy, that we are just colleagues, and she is hallucinating this affair. We are going to deny everything." "She has photos, Richard." "Photos can be faked, but if we show a united, confused front, my mother will believe me. She always believes me. And if my mother backs me, we can fight this." He dragged her to the vanity mirror and threw a makeup bag at her. "Fix it, now. We have a show to put on." Back in Connecticut, I prepared my own stage. I wasn't in the cramped kitchen of my rented apartment anymore. I was sitting in the home office of my new estate. The room was paneled in dark walnut, lined with books. Behind me, floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the darkening ocean, the waves crashing against the rocks below. I sat in a high-backed leather chair that swallowed my small frame, making me look like a judge on a throne. On the desk in front of me, there were no crumpled tissues, no tear-stained letters. There was a neat stack of legal files. There was a forensic accountant's report, and sitting just out of the camera's frame, Silas Thorne sat quietly, checking his watch. 5 minutes to 8, Silas said, his voice calm. "I am ready," I replied. I checked my reflection on the monitor. My face was impassive. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like the CEO of a company that specialized in pain. I watched the digital clock on my screen tick down. 7:59, 8:00. I clicked the button to start the call. The screen flickered to life, splitting into a grid of terrified faces. The trap was set. The prey was waiting. And I was about to close my jaws. The digital clock on my laptop screen hit 8 o'clock, and the grid of faces popped up one by one, like contestants on a game show from hell. First came Beatrice, my mother-in-law, sitting in her gilded living room, clutching a martini glass so tightly I thought the stem might snap. Her face was a mask of furious confusion. Then Richard's sisters, Sarah and Claire, joined from their respective homes, looking annoyed to be interrupted from their evening routines but terrified enough by my threat to show up. And then, the main event. Richard's feed flickered to life. The connection was grainy. The background a pitch-black void of the ocean at night, illuminated only by the harsh, unflattering light of the cabin's desk lamp. He was squeezed into the frame, and next to him, looking like a deer caught in high beams, was Elena. She was wearing a cocktail dress that was far too fancy for an interrogation, her makeup pristine, but her eyes red-rimmed. Richard had a hand clamped on her forearm, anchoring her in place. "What the hell is this? Dorothy?" Richard barked before I could even say hello. The audio crackled with static. "You lock my accounts. You send insane emails to my board. Are you having a psychotic break?" He was trying to bulldoze me. It was his signature move: attack first, confuse the narrative, make the other person defend themselves. I didn't speak. I didn't even look at the camera lens. I looked down at my keyboard and pressed a single key. Share screen. The grid of faces shrank, replaced by a high-definition image that filled everyone's monitors. It was a scan of the lottery ticket. The numbers were blown up, sharp and undeniable. Next to it was the official validation receipt from the State Lottery Commission, dated the night of the Christmas party. Jackpot winner $100 million. There was a moment of absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when a bomb drops but hasn't exploded yet. Then chaos. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. Beatrice dropped her martini glass. I heard the shatter. But she didn't even look down. She leaned into her camera, her eyes bulging. "That is the ticket. That is the scratch-off. I told Richard to give that to you. It was my idea." Her face transformed from fury to a grotesque, greedy delight. She clapped her hands together. "We won, Richard. Do you see this? We are rich." "Oh, Dorothy. Darling. That is wonderful. We need to call the financial advisors immediately." I unmuted my microphone. My voice was calm, devoid of any warmth. It cut through their celebration like a razor. "Correction, Beatrice," I said. "I am rich. You, specifically, are not." Beatrice's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "You are family. What is yours is ours. Richard is your husband." "Not for long," I said. I clicked the next slide. The lottery ticket vanished. In its place appeared a collage of photographs. They were the ones the private investigator had taken over the last 3 days. Richard and Elena kissing by the pool. Richard hands up Elena's skirt at the bar. And next to the photos, a spreadsheet of expenses. Elena Vance, apartment rental. $65,000. Elena Vance, Porsche. Lease. $18,000. Elena Vance, jewelry Cartier. $42,000. Source of funds, Sterling Horizon. Corporate accounts. Elena let out a strangled sob. She tried to jerk away, to scramble out of the frame, but Richard's grip on her arm tightened, his fingers digging into her flesh. He pulled her back, his face turning a mottled shade of red. "That is a lie," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "Those are doctored. She is just an assistant. Those expenses are for client entertainment." "Really?" I asked. "Is the apartment for clients? Is the Porsche for clients? Because I have the lease agreements right here. Richard, with your signature." I clicked again. The screen changed to the forged mortgage documents, the deed to my grandmother's house, with my name scrawled at the bottom in a handwriting that was visibly not mine. "And this," I asked, "is this for clients?" "You forged my signature to sell my home to pay off your gambling debts. That is a felony. Richard, it is called fraud." "I was going to pay it back," Richard yelled, sweating profusely now. "It was a bridge loan. You don't understand business." "I understand that you stole from me," I said. "But that is not the worst part." I clicked one more time. The screen filled with the medical logs from Arthur's care. The toxicology report highlighted in neon yellow. Sedative overdose, antipsychotic toxicity. "This is the toxicology report for your father." "Richard," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming colder, harder. "You have been poisoning him. You have been drugging your own father to make him incompetent so you could raid the family trust." Beatrice let out a scream. "What? No, Richard would never. Arthur has dementia." "He does not have dementia." "Beatrice," I said. "He has a son who was trying to kill his mind. I moved Arthur to a secure facility 2 days ago. He has been detoxed. He is awake. And he is very, very lucid. He has already given a statement to the police." Richard's face went white. The color drained out of him so fast, he looked like a corpse propped up in front of the camera. He looked at the screen, at the damning evidence, and for the first time, he realized the walls weren't just closing in. They had already crushed him. "This isn't just adultery, Richard," I said, leaning into the camera so my face filled his screen. "This is criminal, embezzlement, forgery, identity theft, elder abuse, attempted manslaughter." "You can't prove intent," Richard shrieked, desperate now, flailing. "It was the doctor. The doctor made a mistake. We have the emails. Richard." I lied smoothly, or maybe I didn't. Silas probably did. "We have the texts to the nurse. We have everything." You bitch." Richard lunged at the camera. his face distorted by rage. "You can't do this to me. I am your husband, spousal privilege. You can't testify against me." "I am not just your wife anymore, Richard," I said. "I am the woman holding the knife." "You won't do it," he sneered, trying to regain some semblance of control, trying to find the weak woman he thought he knew. "You don't have the guts. You are weak. You are nothing without me. You won't send me to jail." I looked at him. I looked at the man I had once thought I loved, the man who had spent 10 years chipping away at my soul until he thought there was nothing left. "You are right about one thing," I said softly. "I wouldn't send you to jail." Richard let out a breath, a smug smirk beginning to form on his lips. "See, I knew you." "I am not sending you to jail," I interrupted. "The FBI is—" I stepped back from the camera lens, just a fraction, allowing the figure standing in the shadows behind me to step into the light. Silas Thorne moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who knows he has already won the war before the first shot is fired. He adjusted his silk tie, looked directly into the camera lens, and offered Richard a smile that was entirely devoid of humor. "Good evening, Mr. Henshaw," Silas said. His voice was deep, smooth, and carried the weight of a gavel striking wood. "For the record, my name is Silas Thorne. I am currently acting as the primary legal counsel for Mrs. Dorothy Henshaw, and as of this morning, I am also the newly appointed power of attorney for Mr. Arthur Henshaw." Richard recoiled as if he had been slapped. You are representing my father. That is impossible. He is incompetent." "He was medicated," Silas corrected, his tone razor-sharp. "He is no longer medicated. In fact, I spent the last 3 hours with him. He is quite lucid. Richard, lucid enough to review the company financials. Lucid enough to see the unauthorized withdrawals." Silas picked up a document from the desk and held it up to the camera. "This is a resolution passed by the Emergency Board of Directors meeting held 1 hour ago." Silas continued. "Effective immediately. You are removed from your position as CEO of Sterling Horizon. You are stripped of your voting rights. You are fired. Richard, for that reason, which means your severance package is 0. Your stock options are frozen pending the criminal investigation." On the screen, Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. The reality of the situation had finally pierced through her delusion of wealth. The lottery money was not hers. The company money was gone. The golden goose was not just dead. It was being dissected on live video. "No!" Beatrice cried out, her face pressing close to her camera, distorting her features into a grotesque mask of panic. "You can't do this. He is a Henshaw. It is his birthright." "He is a criminal, Mrs. Henshaw," Silas said coldly. Beatrice's eyes darted wildly, searching for a lifeline, for someone to blame other than her precious son. Her gaze landed on Elena, who was shivering next to Richard in the ship's cabin. "It is her," Beatrice screamed, pointing a manicured finger at the screen. "It is that whore. She did this. She seduced him. Richard is a good boy. He would never steal. She confused him. She made him sign those papers." Elena flinched, looking at the woman who had, just days ago, complimented her dress and welcomed her into the inner circle. The betrayal was absolute. "I didn't," Elena sobbed, her composure shattering completely. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup, making her look young and terrified. She turned to Richard, grabbing his lapels. Tell them you made me do it. You said it was tax optimization. You said if I didn't sign the shell company papers, you would fire me." Richard shoved her away, disgust written all over his face. "Shut up. Elena, stop sniveling." "No, I won't shut up," Elena screamed, turning back to the camera, addressing me directly. "Dorothy, please, I have the emails. I have the texts where he threatened me. He said he would ruin my career if I didn't help him move the money. He said he would protect me." "He lied," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the screaming match like a blade. The room fell silent. Beatrice was panting. Elena was weeping into her hands. Richard sat frozen, his eyes wide, looking like a rat that realizes the trap has no exit. I leaned forward again, reclaiming the center of the frame. I looked at my husband. I really looked at him. For years, I had seen him as a giant, a man of impossible standards that I could never meet. Now, looking at him shivering in a cabin, stripped of his title, his money, and his dignity, I realized he was tiny. He was small, mean, and hollow. "Do you remember the Christmas party, Richard?" I asked. He stared at me, his jaw working, unable to form words. "Do you remember the moment you reached into your wallet?" I continued, keeping my eyes locked on his. "You pulled out that crumpled piece of paper. You laughed. You threw it on the table like it was garbage. You told me it was what I deserved. $2. That was the value you placed on me. That was the value you placed on our 10 years of marriage." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the physical ticket. I hadn't burned it. Not yet. I held it up. "You were right, Richard. It was exactly what I deserved, but not for the reason you thought." I lowered the ticket and placed my hands on the desk. "I took that $2, Richard, and I used it to buy my freedom. But I didn't stop there. I used the rest of the money to ensure that you pay for every single tear I shed in that cold apartment you forced me to live in." Richard swallowed hard. "Dorothy, listen to me. We can talk about this. The money. 50% of it is mine. We are married. Community property." "Actually," Silas interjected smoothly, "since the ticket was a gift, and the winning occurred after a documented separation where you publicly declared financial independence, and considering the fraud, well, let us just say the courts are going to be very unsympathetic to your claim, but that is not the immediate problem." I nodded to Silas, then turned back to Richard. "The immediate problem, Richard, is your debt." "My debt." Richard blinked. "The loan from Onyx Capital," I said. $2 million, high interest. You missed the payment last week because you were too busy buying cruise tickets. You missed the payment this week because I froze your accounts." Richard's face went gray. He knew who Onyx Capital was. He knew what they did to people who didn't pay. "I bought the note, Richard," I said. "I am the sole creditor of your debt. I own it, which means I own you." I picked up a piece of paper from the stack. "I have already filed for an emergency seizure of assets to satisfy the debt. My lawyers are cataloging everything. The Bentley, the golf clubs, the artwork." I paused, my eyes drifting to his wrist. "Even that Patek Philippe watch you are wearing right now. Take it off, Richard. It belongs to me." Richard instinctively covered his watch with his other hand, looking horrified. "You can't leave me with nothing," he whispered. "I am your husband." "You left me with nothing but a $2 ticket," I replied. "I am just returning the favor." He slumped back in his chair, defeated. He looked around the cabin, the luxury suite that had been his pride just an hour ago, now feeling like a prison cell. "Well," he muttered, a broken, hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. "At least I am in the Caribbean. At least I can stay on this boat until I figure something out. You can't touch me in international waters." I smiled. It was a cold, wintry smile. "Oh, Richard," I said softly, "you really should check the itinerary." "What?" "I spoke to the cruise line management this morning," I said. "Or rather, the federal agents investigating a massive corporate fraud ring spoke to them. They were very cooperative." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Look out the window, Richard." He hesitated, then slowly turned his head. He pulled back the heavy velvet curtain of the cabin window. Instead of the endless dark horizon of the open ocean, lights were flashing, blue and red lights, intense, blinding searchlights cutting through the darkness. Illuminating the white hull of the ship, the water below was churning with the wake of multiple fast-moving vessels. "That is not the Bahamas," I said. Richard scrambled up from the chair, pressing his face against the glass. "It is the U.S. Coast Guard," I informed him, "and they are boarding the ship right now." I watched his back as he stood there, trembling. "Happy Christmas, Richard," I whispered. "Your gift has arrived." "You see, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the panic rising in his chest. When you owe $2 million to a shadow lender, that is a civil problem, but when you move stolen corporate funds across international borders to pay for a mistress and a diamond necklace, that is a federal crime. And as your primary creditor and the whistleblower who handed over the digital keys to your little laundering scheme. My lawyer didn't just call the bank, he called the United States Coast Guard, and he called Interpol. On the screen, Richard stumbled back from the window, his face a portrait of absolute terror. The blue and red lights from outside pulsed through the cabin, painting his skin in alternating shades of bruised purple and violent crimson. He looked like a trapped animal, his eyes darting from the door to the balcony, as if calculating whether he could swim to safety. "They are not here for a noise complaint," I continued, leaning back in my chair, watching him unravel. "They are here for you." From the speakers of my laptop, a low mechanical wail began to bleed into the audio feed. It was the sound of a heavy siren, close and getting closer. Richard scrambled to the balcony door and threw it open. The sound exploded into the room, the roar of engines, the chop of water, and a megaphone booming a command that was distorted by the wind but unmistakable in its authority. "Heave to and prepare to be boarded." Richard spun around, his back to the ocean, his chest heaving. "Dorothy, stop this. Call them off. I will sign the divorce papers, I will give you the house, I will give you everything." "You have nothing to give," I said calmly. "I already took it." I leaned into the microphone, savoring the words I had practiced in the silence of my empty apartment for nights on end. "Merry Christmas, Richard. Your gift is a pair of handcuffs." Before he could scream again, the door to his luxury cabin splintered inward. It wasn't a knock. It was an explosion of force. A battering ram hit the lock, and the door flew open, crashing against the wall. 4 agents in tactical gear with federal agent emblazoned on their chests stormed into the small room. "Federal agents, get on the ground now." The command was a roar that peaked the audio on the video call, sending a screech of feedback through the connection. Richard threw his hands up, backing away until his legs hit the bed. "I am Richard Henshaw. I am the CEO. You can't touch me." On the ground. An agent lunged forward, grabbing Richard by the shoulder of his expensive linen shirt. Richard tried to shove him away. A final, pathetic act of arrogance. It was a mistake. The agent swept his leg, and my husband, the man who thought he was a god, hit the floor with a bone-jarring thud. "My arm! You are breaking my arm!" Richard screamed as his face was pressed into the carpet. "Richard, help me!" Elena shrieked. She was huddled in the corner, trying to hide behind a curtain. A female officer moved in on her, pulling her hands behind her back. "Elena Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering," the officer recited, her voice flat and professional. "No, he made me do it," Elena wailed, thrashing against the restraints. Her perfect hair was a mess, her face contorted. "I am just an assistant. He promised me it was legal. Look at him, he is the liar." I watched it all unfold in high definition. It was chaotic, loud, and violent. But to me, it looked like a symphony. I watched the zip ties cinch tight around Richard's wrists, the same wrists that had tossed a lottery ticket at me with such disdain. I watched him being hauled to his feet, his shirt torn, his eyes wild and weeping. He looked at the camera one last time. He looked right at me. "Dorothy!" he howled, a sound of pure desperation. "Dorothy, please." I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just watched. On the other squares of the video grid, the Henshaw family was witnessing the annihilation of their name. Beatrice was hyperventilating, her hand clutching her chest. "My boy. They are hurting my boy. Do something. Call the governor." "Mother, stop it," Sarah shouted from her own square. "It is the feds. We have to go. We have to hang up." "We can't be seen on this call," Claire hissed, her face pale. "If they trace this to us, if they think we knew about the trust." One by one, the sisters disappeared. Connection terminated. Connection terminated. Beatrice was the last one left. She stared at the screen, watching her son being dragged out of the cabin door, his bare feet scraping against the floor. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped sideways onto her velvet sofa, fainting dead away in her empty mansion. The feed from the cabin remained active for a few more seconds, showing only the empty, ransacked room and the open balcony door where the curtains blew wildly in the Caribbean wind. Then, an agent noticed the laptop. A hand reached out, filling the frame, and the screen went black. Call ended. Silence rushed back into my office. It was a heavy, profound silence, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the black screen. I expected to feel empty. People always say revenge leaves you hollow. They say it doesn't bring peace. They are wrong. I felt full. I felt heavy with satisfaction, grounded and solid for the first time in years. I slowly closed the laptop lid. I swiveled my chair around, sitting in the shadows of the room, positioned so he could see the large monitor on the wall where I had cast the call. Was Arthur? He was in his wheelchair, a blanket over his knees. Silas stood behind him, looking like a silent guardian. Arthur's face was pale, but his eyes were clear. The drugs were out of his system, and the fog had lifted. He had watched his son be destroyed. He had watched the empire he built be dragged through the mud to save it from a rot that had gone too deep. I walked over to him and knelt down, placing my hand over his trembling fingers. "It is over, Arthur," I whispered. "He can't hurt you anymore. He can't hurt the company anymore." Arthur looked at me. His lips trembled, fighting the lingering effects of the stroke and the poison. He managed a nod, slow and deliberate. A single tear escaped his eye, tracking through the deep groove of his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a relief. It was the release of a burden he had carried in silence for months. He squeezed my hand. His grip was weak, but I felt gratitude in it. He smiled, a crooked, weary smile that said, "Thank you." "I will take care of everything," I promised him. "Silas and we will rebuild it, properly this time." I stood up and walked to the sliding glass doors that led to the penthouse terrace. I slid them open and stepped out into the night. The wind was biting, carrying the salt spray of the Atlantic, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt a strange, internal warmth, a fire that had burned down the old world to make way for the new. I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the rough edge of the card. I pulled it out. The lottery ticket. It was crumpled, the corners soft and worn from where Richard had clenched it, from where I had sweated over it. Winner. $100 million. I looked at the number. It was a life-changing amount of money. It was freedom. It was power. But looking at it now, I realized it was just paper. The real power didn't come from money. The money was just a tool, a hammer I had used to break the glass. The real power had come from me. It had come from the moment I decided to stop crying and start fighting. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a silver lighter. I flicked the wheel, and a small orange flame danced in the wind, struggling to stay alive. I brought the flame to the corner of the ticket. The paper caught instantly. The fire curled the edge, turning the bright colors black. I watched the flame eat its way up, consuming the barcode, consuming the jackpot amount, consuming the memory of Richard's sneer when he threw it at me. I held it until the heat stung my fingertips, until there was nothing left but a fragile flake of gray ash. I opened my hand. The wind caught the ash, swirling it up and over the railing, carrying it out into the dark, endless night over the city. I didn't need the ticket anymore. I had the trust. I had company. I had my dignity. And I had the truth. I didn't need luck. I had justice. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Richard's punishment. If you enjoyed this tale of retribution, please subscribe to the Scarlet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so this story can reach even more people. Your support means the world to me.